Hello, everybody, and welcome to this, our very first summer session of the Essence podcast. I'm delighted to invite onto the show Ariana Serpentine. Thank you, Ariana, for coming on, and so quickly,
You're
too.
welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I reached out to Ariana about 2 days ago with the intention of having her later on in the summer. And it just so worked that we could record this now. So this is a re-recorded session. For those of you who are just joining the podcast, we will have both live and pre-recorded sessions throughout the summer. And I'm delighted that this is our very first one. So introducing our guest here, Ariana Serpentine is a multi-traditional witch, polytheist, and animist. She describes herself as a theology and history nerd, and I'm also a history and theology nerd too. She is trans and queer and is a Mercurial Girl. Ariana has worked in political trans activism, raising awareness of the needs of her community within Pagan and other circles. And she is the author of Sacred Gender, Create Trans and Non-Binary Spiritual Connections, also published by Llewellyn Worldwide. Ariana, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So we were just chatting beforehand, but eventually I had to stop because there was going to be way too much good stuff that I wanted to talk about. But we were talking about kind of the process of writing this book. So can you, in a small blurb, tell us what is the book and why did you write it?
Well, the book is a few things. It's three books in a trench coat, kind of, is one of the ways that I've described it before. But a lot of it is, the seeds that were planted for this book came actually a decade or two ago, where as a queer person moving through pagan communities, I encountered a lot of difficulty with some of the imagery that was used, some of the way that the theologies were described, because they didn't conform, or they weren't very adaptable to who I was as a person and how my life worked. And nevertheless, I was still drawn to them and wanted to be able to connect to them. And I discovered that that was an issue for a lot of other queer people as well. Um, I came out as trans about 10 years ago now. It was in 2013 that I came out publicly, although I had started coming out privately before that. And I had been out as queer of one variety or another for a long time before that as well. But coming out as trans added an additional layer of difficulties in connecting to the way that pagan and polytheist theologies and cosmologies were uh, were presented, and it was very challenging for me. And so the book was kind of my response to that. This is the book that would have helped me ease my way into these things 20 years ago, 10 years ago, when I was having these difficulties in the first place. The book is about different perspectives, and specifically about trans perspectives and non-binary perspectives. And it's my perspective primarily, and I'm upfront about that. There are many other voices that need to be heard and listened to on this, you know, and I'm just one voice among many. But it was my response to many of the difficulties that I encountered, and some of the ones that I've seen other people encounter in dealing with and trying to interface with and connect to pagan and polytheist theologies and cosmologies. I believe that everyone deserves to be able to see themselves in the stars. Part of religion and part of spirituality is connecting the smaller part of yourself, the small self here, to the greater self of the cosmos, to the larger things in the world, to the greater spirits and gods. And if you have a cosmology or a theology that is not set up where trans and non-binary people can see themselves in it, then you're excluding an important and prominent part of humanity. You're cutting out a large and significant part of the human experience. And I don't think that does anyone any benefit. I think that that's very limiting for cisgender and straight people, as well as obviously being alienating for trans and non-binary people. So the book goes through a few different things. It talks about gender and relationship with the ancestors, with the dead, with the gods, with other spirits, the spiritual aspects of the self, and your own inner spirit and divinity. And really, the goal was to help people find ways to connect and restructure and rethink the ways that they present these cosmologies and adapt these cosmologies to their practices.
Beautiful, beautiful. I haven't even said congratulations yet.
Oh,
Congratulations on it coming out.
Thank you.
It came out about 6 months ago, and I
Yes.
remember being very excited. So I came out as non-binary about 2 years ago now. Well, no, about 18 months ago. I can't even. So time is just all over the place, right?
It is, especially since the pandemic.
And I remember going and looking because suddenly there was this avalanche of understanding in my own life. Because I came out like yourself. I came out as a different form of queer when I was 15, and that's many, many, many years ago. And suddenly to realize myself within this understanding of gender in a different way than I had been previously, I was like, okay, well, how do I connect the dots here? And I had been connecting with all sorts of different spirits and deities and figures without necessarily understanding the why. And so I was very, very, very excited when your book came out because there was really nothing on the market. Honestly, there was nothing really on the market. I know a couple of the other writers have spoken about it, but Raven Caldera, Lee Harrington, some other figures like that. But there really wasn't a lot out there, and there wasn't a lot recently published. And so I was very, very curious, especially with that non-binary piece. Envis came out with Queer Kabbalah, and I loved it, but I don't connect with Kabbalah in the same way, so it wasn't really a book for me. I love it, and Envis is going to be on the podcast too, so we can talk a lot more about that in a couple of weeks' time. But I was very curious to kind of take and see what you were writing about, and I loved first of all that you said that it was your perspective, because one thing that is really resounds in this is that it's a very intimate, personal book for you.
It is, yes.
Yeah. So in the journey of creating this, having gone through writing my own book in the past 2 years too, I know what changes have happened for me. What did you learn about yourself as you wrote this book? I'm going to give you all the huge bangers in
oh yes. What did I learn about myself? Sorry, this is taking me a moment.
It's okay. No, it's okay.
Well, there were a lot of questions that I had to answer myself before I felt satisfied in writing anything about them. And some of those questions involved, one of the ones was just when I've seen attempts at approaches to pagan spirituality that involves trans and non-binary people, so often it is a reflection, it's just further reflections of masculine and feminine, or different ways of saying similar things. And those ways of saying similar things may be more helpful, but one of the most difficult pieces that I found was trying to figure out where I felt, because I'm also non-binary, I'm a trans woman, but I'm also non-binary as well. What I felt about non-binary identity and where I felt that within myself, because the part of me that is non-binary doesn't connect to masculine or feminine at all. And so one of the things I was asking is if masculine and feminine are just two poles, and they aren't necessarily even the center of the ocean that is gender, then where is the center? What is the center? Where does everything revolve around? What? And the answer that I came to is, at least for me, I don't think there is one, and there doesn't need to be one. A circle is all lines and no center, right? Or, well, not a circle, but you can that was a terrible analogy. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
It's possible for you to have a concept of gender and a connection to it that doesn't necessarily revolve around masculine and feminine. And so finding that in myself was an important part in trying to bring through some of the concepts that I do bring through in the book.
Right. Did it shift as you were starting to realize that as you were working through this material? Did you find that suddenly what you had already written needed to shift and change because of that perspective change? I mean, it was a long time you were writing this book.
Yeah, it took me a few years. I started the original concepts and drafts for it sometime in the late 2010s, and then I kind of set it aside. A lot of life was going on, but during the pandemic, I was laid off as part of the early pandemic. I worked in healthcare, and there were a lot of things shifting, and so I had a period of time where I wasn't as focused. I was fortunate to not be as focused on my job. I was on unemployment and working out a new living situation. And so I had time to sit down and really chew through some of those answers. And so it didn't so much shift as what I would have said a few years ago had I written it, where it was vastly different from what the final product ended up being.
What struck me with what you said there is that you had already started putting some of this together in the 2010s.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about that journey? Like what precipitated you to starting to put this together and then putting it aside, and then what brought you back to it?
Well, I think when I started wanting to write this book was probably around in 2013, because so I don't know, are you familiar with PantheaCon? Some of your listeners may not have been familiar, but PantheaCon was a conference, a pagan conference in the US and on the West Coast, and it was one of the most popular and prominent ones until it ended a couple of years ago. Been going for a long time. And a lot of cultural issues that would happen at PantheaCon would then echo through and ripple through the pagan communities across the US and across other parts of the world too. And so it was this kind of locus of activity. And I think it was in 2011 that there was an issue with trans women attending a women's ritual that ended up causing, protests and conflicts at PantheaCon. And I wasn't living on the West Coast at the time. I was living on the East Coast. But at our local festivals and communities, the results of these conversations and conflicts happening was that they started popping up in our communities as well. And I'm like, well, we need we need to be able to resolve and answer and discuss some of these questions and come to a resolution that works for us, And I wrote a few blog posts that were connected to ideas around that. And some of those blog posts ended up being seeds that grew into portions of the book and some of the things that I ended up talking about in the book. So really, I'd say the process really started around 2013 with just when things were brewing socially for me. And my challenge to the concept of women's rituals and men's rituals. And yeah, after that, different bits and pieces added themselves on as I started exploring ancestor work and work with the dead more. That became a prominent part and an important part. As I went from being vaguely pantheist to being specifically generally polytheist and animist, questions about how gender relates to deities came up. And so it evolved organically until I had a space in a container to actually sit down and write it out as an entire piece came in. And I realized once I got to that point, I'd been saying for years, people had been asking me, when are you going to write a book? And I'm like, I don't have anything book shaped. I've got blog posts and I've got conversations, but I don't have a book in me. And then I realized there was enough for it to be a book. So I took all of these independent pieces and formed a constellation out of them. And the constellation that grew out of them ended up being Sacred Gender. So.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I really resonate with what you said about when are you going to write a book? When are you going to write a book?
Right.
I feel like that's the typical story of most authors, unless they're really dedicated and really going out there to write something. But those reluctant writers who eventually put out something incredible. I keep looking over here. I actually have Secret Gender on the screen over here, and and there is a piece. It's one of those kind of tech wizard kind of stuff. But just the flow of it is quite interesting because I kind of looking at it, my reading of it would be there's a very particular flow. So you start with the question, chapter 1, what is gender? You go into gender and paganism, polytheism, and then you start working and those categories of beings. So gender and the dead, gods and gender, and then you bring it back to ourselves. What was the process of structuring that book for those who are going to pick this up? And I highly recommend people do pick this up after this chat. What was the process of structuring? How did you structure it? Why did you structure it the way you did? What's your intention with that?
Well, I started it with basically a 101 because I needed to give that because I knew that some people were going to need it. And I also knew that if people read it in the future, they would need a snapshot of how we were talking about these things at this time,
Nice.
too, because conversations, language, our understandings of things in queer theory and queer politics and queer discussion, they change over time and they're going to. So we needed context. So I wanted to build context with the early chapter. And I wanted to address broader social concepts within paganism and polytheism and related circles before we got into the social concepts, before we got into the specific practical concepts of how this would then apply to your cosmology and parts of your cosmology, like working with the dead, like honoring the gods, and like understanding your own sacred self. And so I worked externally a little bit. Now I need to look at the table of contents really quick, but yeah. So I started with the dead because that's where everything starts. You're human, and if you're human, you have ancestors, and if you have ancestors, that's where you come from, and that's where everything began. So we begin with the dead and with talking about the dead, and then I moved into talking about the gods because that's the next logical step there. And then I went into talking about yourself because I wanted to draw things together in the end. And there are parts, for me personally, I understand parts of the self as being reflections of parts of the cosmos, there being a microcosm, macrocosm thing going on there. And I wanted to explore the external parts before I brought it back home and synthesized it within the cauldron of the individual who was reading it.
Makes total sense. But to me,
Yeah.
it's a very intuitive way of seeing that too.
Mm.
When I was developing my own work, I kept coming back to that cycle of constantly coming back. I suspect that's probably because of a similarity in some of our shared traditions. We were talking before about some of our shared traditions, and
Yes.
that process of coming back again to self, which is that outward expression or inward expression, the outwards, right? Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When I was of course, I want to ask you more about the ancestral piece, but I do want to
Sure.
touch on the deity piece too. Something that I've been kind of struggling with, and that question of connection with deity.
Hmm.
Certainly, the deities that I work with, or who have been part of my life, I started to see that the ones I was really connected with were ones that I could see directly related or had an impact in my life. So
Hmm.
Shiva, Hermes, Oshun, a lot of gods of change, because change has been such a huge part of my own personal story, right?
Hmm.
So I always like to ask this of people, especially in the queer community, because there's such a variety of ways that queer people connect with deities through that lens of queerness. And I'm curious with you, when it comes to your relationship to your deities, and you can talk about them if you feel comfortable, but when it comes to your relationship with those deities, is it and I'm careful not to create a false binary here, but is it you're seeking out trans deities, or are you seeking out queer deities, or are you finding the queer aspects of deities in general? And what's that process been like for you?
More the third one than the other two.
Mm,
Um, so I think I mentioned it in the book, but I had an experience when I was heavily involved with heathenry, with Germanic paganism,
mm,
where as a trans and queer person, people kept telling me you should really worship Loki because Loki is trans and queer, and I kept pulling back from Loki for that reason because I don't like being told what to do and because I didn't appreciate the assumptions. I'm like, Loki might be queer, but Loki's not queer in a way that I'm queer. So I don't really see that connection. And over time, I warmed up to Loki for other reasons. His disrespect of unjust authority figures was a big one. Um, and um, and I grew to understand their queerness and appreciate it and love it. But that's not how I approached them originally.
Mhm.
And so I mean, there's a little bit of chicken and egg. Was I attracted to worshiping a deity because they had queer associations? Well, I mean, in some cases like Dionysos, probably. And other associations like with Freya and the Vanir, her brother, and that particular family of Germanic gods, a lot of the queerness is inferred by stuff that we've read historically, but is not confirmed by it. Um, and some of it is reflected among modern followers, but a lot of it isn't.
Mhm.
And there are some people who have very heterosexist takes on the Vanir as well. So it's really, I feel that it is possible to see queerness in almost any god because they're not human. And there's a level, when I'm talking about queerness in a broader sense, of reaching outside of the boundaries that we create and place as human beings, um, outside of these rigid categories that are formed about what man and woman is, what gay and straight are, what gender is opposite of what gender,
Mhm.
and where those things come from. Deities are too vast to be encompassed by these things.
Mhm.
Um, and when it comes down to it, I don't think, although I will still use gendered pronouns frequently with most deities, I don't think of them necessarily as gendered beings because how are you going to gender a constellation of consciousness? You
Mhm.
know, how are you going to gender a being that is beyond us in that way?
Mhm.
Um, if we do gender them, then just like with other human beings, it's because we're assigning that gender.
Mhm.
And the question that would come to me is why do we assign that gender? Why is Apollon a man? Was a question that came up for me when I was writing the book. Is it because some of his qualities reminded the people who first encountered or interacted with him of how they viewed how men should be in their culture? I
Mhm.
kind of lean towards that understanding more. But that also means that we can look at them through other lenses as well. What would it be like if you saw a deity as a gender other than the one that they are socially assigned? What
Mhm.
would happen if they appeared to you that way, which is something that happens to people? And I've encountered people talking about, and has happened to me as well. What would happen if they challenged that take themselves? Um, and so yeah, I feel that it's more the third thing that you said, which is finding the queer narratives, because you can find queer narratives there. You can find queer narratives everywhere.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. The reason I asked that particularly was I've noticed, and I've had questions fielded to me from the queer community around ancestor
mhm,
veneration myself and spirituality in general. There tends to be that phase, almost a phase of trying to find the affirming narrative
mhm,
in deities when people are still finding themselves. And,
mhm,
and as soon as people start to feel comfortable in themselves and really solid in what that means for them, whether it be trans identity, non-binary identities, sexual identities, relational identities,
mhm.
um, suddenly there's an expansion. You know, you're not going to Antinous, for example, because he's a gay god. You're going to,
Right.
there's so many other pieces to him, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, it's really interesting, but I still see even within kind of the heteronormative and cisgender community that idea. Oh well, you know, there's a gay god for you, and there are
Right.
a couple of books out there on gay trans gods, and so
Mhm,
the assumption then is, oh well, those are the deities for those people,
mhm,
and it's just another way of viewing people, particularly in, I think it's interesting, it's not just in the Western culture. I know in Brazil, for example, the Orisha Oshumare, who
mhm,
is looked at within that culture as being, the gay Orisha, or the gays are the children of Oshumare, and then, go and so there's almost like an assumption then, if you're gay, you're automatically going to be washed for
mhm.
Oshumare. So it's an interesting kind of heteronormative way, I think, imposed on the queer community that the queer community then takes up as, okay, well, we need to find our queer deities. Um, And that hasn't been my experience. I'm really pleased that hasn't been your experience.
Yeah. And that's honestly, I listed some deities that I connect to transness in the book, and I was reluctant to do that at first. But I realized that to present my ideas about not only how we have always been here and we've always had deities that are associated with queerness, but also to take the idea that any deity can be associated with queerness or can be affirming or can be associated with a queer person, period. Um, uh, I I realized it would be helpful to give some examples of what I was thinking, the way I thought about those things.
As a beginning kind of conversation starter.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely, absolutely. I do like the deities that you've spoken about in the book here. I'm just bringing them up here. So Freya, Frey, Dionysus, Cybele.
Mm-hmm.
Cybele.
Kybele or
That's
Kybele. Yeah. Mhm.
I just took a class on Roman and Greek religion, so I
Oh,
should
cool.
know that. You've got Loki, you've got Odin,
Mm-hmm.
very diverse group of deities that you're connecting. And so I'm curious, Dan, because I'm sure I'm making an assumption here, but I'm sure you connect with them in all sorts of different ways in your spiritual life.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that they're in this book particularly, how do they then connect with people who want to read more about them? I'm not going to read it off the screen here, but for those who want to learn about deities in that way, for you, can you talk about them as a group? What do you see their connection point with sacred gender?
The group with sacred gender. That's the thing, is that these are deities that I have come to honor through different traditions that I've been a part of, but I don't necessarily group them all together.
Mm,
Um, and my practices for them are a little bit distinct depending on uh, where they come from and how they're typically honored and respected. And as I said, some of them have actually the majority of them have
mm,
very openly queer connections, like Kubele and the Gale priestesses, or Dionysos and you know Odin learning women's magic, and Loki just being Loki. But for instance, part of the reason that I felt that Freya and Ingvi Frey were important to bring up as examples was because we don't have a lot of solid historical connection between them and queerness, and yet they have a lot of queer followers these
mm,
days who
mm,
connect to them through their queerness as well as for other reasons. There are so many trans women who worship Freya. There are so many trans women who are called by Freya. There's so many trans women who came out as trans because of the intervention of Freya. It's really interesting phenomenon. And you see interesting and similar things with transmasculine people and her brother Frey. Um, Even though he has a little bit more historical evidence than Freya, but not very much. So I don't see the group of deities that I don't see them necessarily as a group.
mm,
Just these were deities that I have personal experience with, which was important. I didn't want to, like I could have written about Inanna.
mm,
Inanna has so many queer connections as well. But while I respect her, she's not a part of my practice.
mm,
And I don't feel like I could do her justice.
mm,
And that's why I didn't include her, for example. These are all, so most of it was, these are deities that I honor, that I know that have that connection.
mm,
And other people, and I presented them so that other people could see those connections, and in hopes that it might inspire them to see other ones as well. I do, I do have some practice with some Irish deities as well. And I didn't really find a good segue to bring them into the book also, and that's something else that I know some other people have spoken about in the past. And I would love to hear more from people who were better able to talk about that. For instance, people who connect the Dagda to a transmasculine narrative. And
mm,
there are a lot of people who get very agender feels for the Morrigan, and, things like that. So,
mm,
but again, I didn't feel like I was I was as qualified necessarily to speak to those because those weren't my personal experiences. So as you pointed out, a lot of the book it comes from a personal place for me. And so the main grouping is these are deities that I know well, or at least that I know well. These are deities that are an important part of my practice, that connect to queerness for me.
Absolutely. That is one of the one of the major pieces that really come out from this book is how deeply personal and in many ways you're using your practice throughout this book as almost like not even a conversation starter, but as an example not to be followed, but as an example of way forward. I wrote my own book in a very similar way. It's not my job to teach somebody a tradition. It's for them to develop it for themselves, and especially for us who are in marginalized communities, finding those ways forward is really important. Yeah. I will say though, I have Morgan Daimler on next week, and so I'll
be sure
to ask Morgan that question around the Irish deities, because I'm sure they have a lot to say on that. I suspect they'll be talking about fairies a lot, but I don't want to assume, right? But I love that. Now with that being said, and I really appreciate that segue there. Coming then to the ancestral work, because the ancestral chapter is incredible, first of all.
Thank you.
But again, like my experience working with my trans and my queer ancestors, again, has been that very intimate piece. There are some trans ancestors who I have no connection with whatsoever. There are some queer ancestors that I have a lot of connection with because of other reasons. Can you talk around that intimacy then with working with trans ancestors? Kind of what has your journey been around those?
Well, there are different ways that it looks. So for a lot of the trans ancestors that I work with are ones whose names are not written in history, ones who are not as well remembered. While I still venerate ones who are known and ones who have influenced us, because that for me is an important part of the piece of ancestry is someone's your ancestor when they've influenced you, and there's someone who has passed on who has helped to shape you. I venerate them. I honor them. I recite their names. I light candles for them, but they're not always necessarily the ones who are guiding me. A lot of the ancestral spirits, trans ancestral spirits that are guiding me are ones who are not there in the history books, not there in the limelight, not there who are remembered, but who come forward to remind me of things, to support me, and to give me guidance on the way forward and on conducting myself and connecting to others. So as much as I would like to give some insight into that, that's not how it's worked out for me personally. In that, like I said, I venerate a lot of the known ancestors, but it's more the unknown dead who come to me and who have assisted and supported me in this work. We have and this includes one of the things that I point out in the book and that I really want to drive home for a lot of people is that the culture of intolerance towards trans people is new. It's an aberration, it's unhealthy, and it's a part of the culture that we live in, but it isn't the way that it has always been. And one of my first experiences in working with the trans dead involved someone who was from a culture that I can't even name, because when I tried to try and narrow down, like, where are you from? Where are you from? And this became a joke in one of the groups that I was in. I'm part of the people of the valley. Which valley? The valley of the people, right? It's not, we don't have any context because so much of history wasn't written. We only have a tiny amount of human history, 5,000 years of human history. Some of it has been written. Humans have been human for 300,000 years or longer. That's a moment, a flicker of time compared to the amount of time that we have still been living these lives and experiencing these things. So of course there are going to be dead who come forward who you have no context for what what the name of the current country or even past nations that occupied the area where they may have lived were. But that doesn't mean that their advice isn't important and isn't powerful, and that their support isn't very real as well.
Absolutely. we'll get to that question around animism, but the spirits don't fade; they're constantly here, and they're constantly here too. I very much appreciate that piece too. I'm curious then, around connecting with those unnamed. How different is that for you from working with named ancestors? Or let's expand that, named spirit guides. We were talking a little bit about it, spiritism before. It's a shared tradition between us all. What is that distinction for you? Is there a difference there? How does that work for you?
I mean, for me, working with a named ancestor or guide or an unnamed ancestor or guide lasts up until they give me a name, because I usually want something to call them. And it's easier to perform some kind of structured veneration for somebody for whom you have pictures of, who you have details of their life. As an example, it would be easier to set up a shrine for Leslie Feinberg than it is for someone who's you're not even sure what language they spoke while they were alive, right? So it's more intuitively based when we work with the dead who and spirits we do not have good context necessarily for quote unquote where they were from or who they were. A lot of that is more based on what they tell you. Bring me this. I like these things. I like cheese. Bring me cheese.
Yes.
Things like that, as opposed to using the example of Leslie Feinberg, we could look up things that Z liked and were important to hear and include those in ancestral veneration for here.
Absolutely. It's that form of communication, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting because the relationship is still there. It just kind of flavors how then you connect, how you understand, how you discern. A friend of mine, she transitioned. Well, she's in the middle of transitioning. Well, I say that like it's a thing. It's always in transitioning.
Sure.
So she is HIV positive, and I talk about her work in my book, and her connecting with the ancestors connected to the HIV virus, all of the previous individuals who were in that lineage for her, and she said it was interesting because she has no idea who they are. All she knows is that she's connected through sexuality for them. And so when she's taking care of herself, she feels that pressure. She feels that validation of yes, you're taking care of yourself. This is good. She's doing all of the things. She's living her life the ways that they couldn't. And I think that in that piece, that relationship piece, doesn't necessarily need to have a name, but
absolutely.
When it comes to working with particular individuals or those nameless individuals, even having just a sense of where they might come from it's a huge part of that communication piece. Absolutely.
And I also see a difference between working with individuals who might come forward who are not necessarily in the history books and working with collectives. Because one of the things that happens when you're working with a collective of ancestors is the way I was taught to see it, and the way that I do see it, is that we're the living embodiment of those ancestors, of all of our ancestors. And so when you open yourself up to a stream of ancestors, to a collective or group, you are giving them the opportunity to live and work through you as well. And they're the wave at your back. They're the strength behind you. They're the wind supporting you and the earth beneath your feet. And so working with an individual spirit, you're more likely to direct things back and forth and have conversations. Working with a collective, you're more likely to act on those or to just have your life, your daily life, like you were saying with the other person, being a reflection of that relationship and bringing that relationship forward into the manifest and physical world.
Absolutely. It raises a deeper question for me. And this is something that I'm going to ask it. I'm curious to know what you think anyways.
Yeah.
So, of course, those of us who work in various particular spiritual traditions are always taught to be very careful with the dead as well, because not all the dead are necessarily healthy or in healthy places, right? So one of the reasons we work with collectives in Spiritism, for example, is because it's easier and it's healthier and it's safer to work with collectives who have a healthy spokesperson, right? Working with queer ancestors, because of the levels of oppression that have gone on over the years, and knowing that a lot of those ancestors, affinity ancestors, did not die in very good conditions. Many of them died in very healthy conditions, of course, but not in the past 100 years, I would say.
Yeah.
How would you say then, kind of somebody working with your book for the first time, working with those ancestors and coming across that level of pain and trauma and violence and that history of pain and trauma and violence, what safeguards would you put into place or suggest so that people don't become overwhelmed?
I would suggest, first off, building relationships with healthy ancestors or with ancestors who have a stronger, building a strong bulwark of relationships with ancestors who are in a better condition first, because they can help you connect to and moderate the difficult influences that you're coming to. That's the first thing. The second one is having good connections with deities as well. You know, I mean, this is me as a polytheist speaking, but I believe having the support of the divine is very helpful in having having barriers, having screens, having filters, having people that you can call on if things get ugly. You know, working, you know, having connection to deities who act in a psychopompic fashion, or who specifically work with the dead as part of the work that they do as deities, or who just have a personal connection with you with working with the unquiet dead, would be something that I would suggest people build on. And the third thing that I would suggest is having some kind of having pressure valves for that pain. So having rituals where you mourn, having rituals where you allow the pain, the rage, the loss, those things to be expressed in a controlled setting where afterwards you can get aftercare and have that be taken care of. You know, I know people, and I in the past, I don't always do it now, but in the past I've done things for the Trans Day of Remembrance that are specifically spiritual to help give those ancestors release, some kind of release. Because that's part of the work of working with the dead also, and working with ancestors is, you know, they need help also, and there's help that we can give them. And part of that help and part of that assistance, and they're often grateful for it, is just crying for them, is just feeling for them, just expressing that, especially in a group setting, because then all of the ancestors of all the people there are witness to it as well. And that can be brought forward also. I wish I had more opportunity to go into that in the book. I only gave a very simple exercise, and it's not even from the primary tradition that I work with the dead in. But I also didn't want to write an entire book on ancestor work, and thought that somebody else might be a little bit more qualified to do that, as important as it is to me. So I'm glad that other people, yourself included, are doing some of that work. But yes, finding other elevated or healed ancestors that you can work with is the first part. The second part would be good and strong connections with deities, especially ones who are associated with death and with the guiding of souls. And the third part is giving them an outlet, weeping for them, crying for them, expressing for them, creating art for them, letting there be some kind of pressure valve so that they can release what they were not able to express into the world.
Absolutely. That's so important. Giving manifest to the unmanifested right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
In truth, that's one of the main reasons that we have so many negative spirits coming in and attaching themselves to people, or
Mhm.
trying to influence people, and possess people, in a non healthy way, because
Yeah.
they have those needs that have gone unquenched, right? Yeah,
Mhm. They've been neglected.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Do you think that the role of community in that, can play a more important role? You said in what you just said, finding those outlets, finding those connection points. What do you think the role of the queer community can be in those, in that work?
Well, as other people to receive and guide what comes forward. And I think that finding groups that either are primarily queer or that have a lot of queer members where you can do that sort of ancestor work is helpful also.
Mm,
Because like I said, the dead express themselves in many ways through the living.
mm,
Um, it's healing for us, but it's healing for them also. So I
mm,
think that community is really important when you can find it. And I know not all of us can find it. It's for many queer people, it's hard to find community where they live in the first place, much less finding a group of queer spirit workers who are willing to do some high woo with them
yeah.
um, to help their ancestors. And there might be also be other ways that I haven't explored of um, bringing forth those ancestral streams and that strength and that pain also in a setting that isn't strictly within a spiritual tradition, but I haven't really explored how that would happen yet, but I assume that it would have something to do with art. Um,
Mhm.
but I do think community is important and very helpful if you can have it surrounding this kind of work.
I'm going to have you back on at some point to talk
Oh,
just on the art piece, because I very much agree. A lot of the work I do in my therapy work, is around expression and coming into the body. And a lot of the colleagues that I work with, are art therapists, or they're somatic movement therapists, and that piece around just expressing. You need to come out of here and move into here. That's
mhm.
where art comes from, right? And what I'm noticing is that the vast majority of the of kind of the queer pagan witches online also tend to also be artists as well. There's a
Yeah,
connection there, right?
mhm,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that brings me to one of my last questions. I do have one last
Sure.
question for you after this, but so I've noticed, and again, it could be just perception here, but I've noticed that there tends to be, at least in the queer community and the queer witch community, a move towards animism. And you speak a lot about animism in your book. And I'm curious about your thoughts on that. For people who haven't read your book yet, what do you think is the draw to animism? Why is animism seemingly so popular among at least Western queer people? And what do you think the future of that is?
I think that animism, I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I have a few ideas.
Yeah.
I think that one of the things that draws us to it is a underlying operating assumption of spiritual practice and cosmology that most people can get behind.
Mm,
Um, it's one of the ones that is easier to pick up and easier to connect to because it's a very human thing. Um, I think that as people who experience oppression, understanding what it is like to be affected without being given a voice is also something that queer folks identify with and can
mm,
connect to as well. I once had a student who said to me, I was asking, what would make the world a better place? We were talking about that, and um, their response was, when humanity starts treating everything as though it has a face.
mm,
Um, and that's animism to me, is treating everything as though it has a face. Um, Respecting the world for itself and not just for what the world can bring to you. And I
mhm,
think that speaks very deeply to people who have queer experiences, because so much of the uh, pain around our ostracism and the harm that comes to us is that we aren't providing what other people want to provide. We're not giving what other people want to give. And the way that humanity is treating the natural world is well, it's terrible, and it's part of that too. It's this very functional, very cold, very detached, very
Mm,
brutalistic way of approaching the world that this kind of objectivist framework
mm,
that doesn't touch on the living experience of humanity. And we were talking about art a little bit, and the things that come from the heart and the body, and animism comes from those parts also. Um, those expressions of animism come from the parts of yourself that knows that everything is alive and everything is awake, even if we don't have a good scientific rational framework for describing it. It's an inborn known sense.
mm.
And maybe someday we will. Maybe someday we'll have a ruler to measure these things with. Um, I kind of hope not, because I don't want capitalism to get involved with it any more than it already is. But that inborn, indwelling sense of the knowledge of the awareness of things that that aren't typically seen of as aware, um, and the personhood of things
Mm.
that are not seen as people. I think that
Yes,
speaks very strongly to queer experience.
I totally agree. I totally agree. It's funny, as you were talking, I was reminded of something a mutual friend of ours, Mara Starling, posted the other day.
Mhm.
And I don't really want to talk too much about why she posted that, but it got me thinking, and it's so true. The queer community, at least in the West, has been used to being uh, a commodity. We're safe if we're entertaining people or
Mhm.
giving people sexual experiences that they wouldn't normally get, or if we're just making, the few niches that we're allowed to have in society. But the moment that we say we just want to live our lives, in the same way that nature just wants to live its life,
Mhm.
suddenly it becomes a problem. Suddenly it needs to go. Suddenly it's in the way, and it's that capitalist model. Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
no longer a commodity at that point, and yeah.
yeah. There's a lot to be said around that. I
Mhm.
and I think I think spirituality is often like that too. I've certainly noticed that when, especially people coming from, say, a Judeo-Christian background, mostly a Western Christian background, they
Mhm.
they bring that idea into their paganism.
Mhm.
And that
Oh, very
sense
much
of,
so.
yeah, until eventually they move out. I think, in truth, I think that's partly why, at least from my perspective, why animism seems to be so popular amongst queers, is
Mhm.
that not only is it that liminal space, but it's seeing an entire community populated with all sorts of different niches, for
Mhm.
us. And I personally, I find it very comfortable to see the world like that. Walking through and seeing everything with a face, in the same way that we can walk through our community and see everything with a face in very,
Yes.
very different ways. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
So then, my last question for you then.
Sure.
So the book is really geared and written to the trans and non-binary and queer community. But I'm
Yes.
curious, if a cisgender person, a cis hetero person were to read this, what would you hope they would get out of this? What do you hope that, like, what is the application of this book to anybody, do you think?
Uh, I first off, I really do hope that a lot of cisgender and heterosexual people do read it as well. Um, and I mean, there are a few reasons for that. A lot of the exercises in the book are geared towards a sort of self-reflection and self-exploration,
Mhm.
um, not just of the internal self that we think of as our body, but also the self that is a part of a community, is a part of a religion, is a part of the planet Earth, right?
Mhm.
um, the self that is a part of greater things as
Mhm.
well. But it's important to, there are questions in the book that people who are not cisgender and heterosexual, I have found, do not often ask themselves.
Mhm.
Um, and it's one of the reasons that I think that trans and non-binary people have been given or there's an understanding of our sacredness in a lot of other cultures, and there has been, is because there are things that we have to explore that a lot of people who aren't like us don't need to explore and don't need to think about. So we have reflections on the world and on ourselves and on humanity that that other people don't necessarily come across. And it's because they don't need to, and that's fine, but I think they should.
Mm.
I think they should because it will broaden their understanding. I think that reading this book hopefully will give people who are cisgender and heterosexual a better understanding of some of the things that trans and non-binary people struggle with in these spiritualities that are discussed in the book. I think that it will give them an opportunity to explore parts of themselves and give them challenging questions and thoughts about things that they had already, assumptions that they had carried that they may not even be aware that they were carrying.
Mhm.
And to be honest, I think that some people who are cisgender and heterosexual might come away from reading the book realizing that they're not actually. And there's that too. I hope it's helpful in cracking a few eggs, you know? So that's I really, you know, I had a friend who was like, well, I'm cishet, but you know, so I won't be reading the book, but I'll definitely recommend it to my queer friends. And I'm like, no, please read the book. The book's for you too. Like the book's for us. Like you
Yeah.
know, being honest, like it was written for us. But at the same time, if it had been written, I'm not even sure Llewellyn would have published it if it had been written without an eye towards also including other people in the conversation, you know, and I thought that that was important too
Mm.
because we're all part of the same communities. We all interact in these communities, and and like I said, people need to challenge their assumptions, and people need to within a you know within various frameworks, they need to ask themselves questions and explore things that they wouldn't normally already. So I think there's a lot of value in it. I hope there's a lot of value in it for cisgender and heterosexual people to read through as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank
That's
you.
beautiful. I got a sense from reading this that there was a lot that could be applicable to anybody, and
Hmm.
particularly that piece around cracking the egg, I think is also important. It
Oh
took a
yeah.
long time for me to realize I was non-binary, and in
Hmm.
truth, one of the kind of cracks of the egg for me was meeting a non-binary artist and
Hmm.
seeing how they expressed themselves through art, into coming back to art, right? Um, and that something happened to me. I'm sure also magic mushrooms also helped, but we'll leave
Sure.
another point.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful, Ariana. It's been so wonderful to have you on.
It's
Thank you.
been great.
If people
Yeah.
wanted to get to know more about you and what you do and any offerings that you have, how can we connect with you?
Well, I have a Facebook page, a public-facing Facebook page. I also have a Twitter account, although I'm considering moving off of Twitter just because of how Twitter has been lately.
Mm,
So keep an eye out for me on Mastodon because I intend to be set up there within the next few weeks. By the time this is playing, I should have an account ready there as well. I also have a blog. It doesn't get updated terribly regularly, but it's serpentandtree.com
okay,
is the blog. And sometimes I do public online rituals, so I will post those there if that's happening. I also do consultations and oracular work for people. So those are, you know, that's listed there as well. And those are the best ways to get a hold of me or find me. So
wonderful. I
online.
will put all of those links down below. I'll make sure to get those links from you.
Thank
So
you.
if you're on the YouTube page, they'll be down on the description of the YouTube page there. And if you're on watching this on Facebook, it'll be in the description there. I really hope that you end up writing that book on expanding the ancestral piece. I for sure would love to see a sequel to this. I think that
Mhm.
there needs to be more written. And thankfully, if you write it, then I don't have to write it. So
I have a lot of work before I can write it because there's technique and work that I need to develop and workshop with people before it can be turned into anything that could be transmitted or shared.
mhm.
But that's the long-term work, you know.
Yeah,
I've also told people that I want to work on a book about Dionysos and his crew, especially. And that's in the background too. But I've been reading the sources that I want to read to support that work and to help feed into it as well. So
mhm.
hopefully within a few years I'll have something for that as well.
I love that. I love that. And the Roman Empire is gone. We're back in Aelia. You can bring it back if you want to.
I'm sorry, what?
I said the Roman Empire is long gone. You can bring back the Bacchanalia if you want to.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. We need them. We need Bacchanalia. We need Bacchanalia. We need wild rites. We need to connect to the deeper parts of ourselves through those things. So
Completely.
absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, I'm going to have to stop this because we can
Okay.
just continue and continue. But again, thank
Absolutely.
you so
Yep.
much for coming on.
You're welcome. It's
We'd
been
love to
lovely.
have you back, and I will look forward to seeing that. For those of you who are watching the recording of this, join me next week, and I will have Morgan Daimler. I've also placed on my YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook the rest of the 4 months of this summer series with some really, really cool people coming on. And I think, actually, Ariana, I think you know most of them.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to that. Some really deep conversations. And I would like to invite you, if you're available, to come to my my own book launch, which is happening on September 8th. Sometime, I think 7 p.m. Eastern is when I've set it for, but I will let you know. I would
It's
love
going to be online?
it will be online, yes.
Oh, excellent. Good.
Yeah, I think, well, I wish I could invite people through plane tickets, but I can't.
Oh yeah, no.
My
Right.
advance isn't big enough, unfortunately. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm going to stop this.